The new Mercedes F1 car has been revealed and there's lots to talk about. So let's get straight into it with Scott Mitchell-Malm and Edd Straw. And Scott, I'm going to come to you first. The big talking point over the winter, of course, was the Mercedes sidepods. Would we see big sidepods on the Mercedes, or would we continue with the zero sidepods? It's pretty obvious from looking at the car that they've not gone with the big ones. How would you categorise what they've done, and how have they explained sticking with a concept that nobody else is going near?
Yeah, I think it's more of a sort of zero 0.5 side pods from what we've seen. There is to use a phrase that's cropped up a few times in the sort of Mercedes literature around the launch, they've retained the core DNA of the car. And even though their concept with the W13 wasn't the zero side pods, they stressed that so much last year, it was very much a feature of the W13. So that has been retained into this year. I'm not surprised by that, because they said extensively in the second half of last season that they didn't think their problems were inherently tied to their side pod design. So they've obviously evolved it. There's no secret there that there's evolutions on the bodywork. We can see it in the profiling. So just top surface alone, you can see that there have been modifications, let alone what we can't see underneath. But what's really interesting is I asked Toto Wolff about this and said, is this brave? Or is this entirely rational to go with a completely unique design, or is it a bit of both? And he said, reiterating from last year's points, they don't think that is inherently the fundamental flaw, but he did leave the door open to those side pods changing potentially early in the season. He hinted that there are some development items in the works that could mean the side pods move towards something maybe a bit more conventional. So I think this is what Mercedes is definitely going to start the shakedown and the testing with, maybe start the season with as well. But let's see if 0 or 0.5 side pods remain as the season develops.
Yeah, it's an interesting position for Mercedes to be in, because they stand alone in this side pod design. Williams had it last season. They decided to ditch it middle of the year. Doubtless most, if not all teams, will have had a look at this design in CFD, this side pod geometry, and have decided it's not the way to go. So it might not even be a question of whether the side pods were the fundamental root of their big problems last year, but actually it could be more a question of whether this approach gives them maximum development potential, or whether it puts some kind of ceiling on the performance of the car that can be achieved. So it'd be very interesting to see how these side pods evolve as the season progresses.
And there's lots of other stuff we can see technically on this car, Ed. You've been doing this throughout pre-season for us in these videos on our channel. What else? What are the other major points that stand out to you about this car?
Yeah, there's development and evolution all over the car. The front suspension has changed, although it remains a pushrod configuration. They've done a little bit of work as well to achieve a bit more control of the front end dive. And there's changes to the rear suspension as well. That was expected, because Mercedes needs to widen the window in terms of its suspension setup range. It's difficult to be absolutely sure of this, but it does look like perhaps there's a bit of an increase in the distance from the front wheel to the cooling inlets and the floor inlets at the front of the side pod. That's following a trend a lot of people are going down, because it's important to condition that airflow to set it up to work with best effect, whether it's going into the floor or around the side pods. That airflow coming off the front of the car, the front wing, the suspension, and in particular off those rotating front wheels, needs some work to optimize, and that can have a big effect on the overall effectiveness of the car. There's also various tweaks to the aero shapes. That shroud on the upper side impact cone has changed a little bit. The fin on the engine cover has been modified. It's all part of that iterative tidying up process. But the real key is how it all fits together. It's all about interacting airflows. Very, very, very complicated, the aero map of F1 cars. And Mercedes will hope that it all interacts as it should do to get the downforce and consistency, and also the sensitivity, the consistency across a range of corner speeds that the team wants.
One other detail that I'd like to throw in, which was something that stood out to me as soon as we saw the car, and I was very interested to see if it matched up renders to real thing, was how the back of the car has changed. So the top of the engine cover links in with the side pods, obviously, but we've got what more technically minded people than I have been referring to as the cannon that runs along the back of the engine cover, much more pronounced, runs the sort of full length of it effectively on the Mercedes now. So it's an interesting design choice. It changes the shape and the profiling of that back half of the car, which obviously feeds into the to the rear suspension and down by the diffuser. So interesting to see that Mercedes have gone a bit more aggressively in that area, and it stood out to me as one of those really visual changes that the team has been talking about as quite bold in the direction that they've tried to go.
And also a good example of a design trend that they have followed. So that they're not following everyone else with the side pods, but that we're seeing those cannons, as you called it, appearing on pretty much, well, almost every car this year. But Scott, that's what's changed on the car, or what hasn't changed on the car. It's what the car looks like. A big question, of course, around Mercedes after the year they had in 2022 is, are they going to be a title contender again this year? I'm not expecting you to know exactly how fast that car is just from looking at it at a launch, but you've been speaking to Toto Wolff today. Are there any indications about how confident Mercedes are that they're going to be back right at the front this year?
Well, it was interesting that Wolff admitted with a smile on his face that he laboured over whether to include the word eventually in his press release quotes when he talked about this car eventually being a proper front runner in Formula One. And so the phrasing was deliberate. He talked about obviously getting there in the end effectively, and both he and Mike Elliott, the technical director, have talked about starting the year on the back foot. Basically, they're behind, they're playing catch up. There is a recognition from Mercedes that even though the winter offered a great opportunity for them to make the big changes that they couldn't make in season, and therefore make a bigger step forward than they could have made last year, even when last year the progress was already good, they know that they're still coming from a lower base. So it's not just enough to fix all of the big weaknesses and hope that eradicates the deficit they had last year, because Red Bull and Ferrari won't have stood still over the winter, so they need to gain even further. Reading between the lines, which is obviously a very dangerous thing to do when the car hasn't even run on track yet, I get the impression that Mercedes is sort of expecting to start the year maybe slightly behind, maybe sort of where it was on average over the last 5 or 6 races of last season, maybe sort of second, third best, a couple of 3/10 off, and challenging hopefully a little bit harder in the races. And then when they get those early developments, which they're already talking about, that will then elevate them properly, consistently into the lead fight. So that's what I would say. I would say sort of cautious optimism from Mercedes at best. I think there is definitely a realism. There's been some noises over the winter that maybe they haven't made the stunning gains that they were hoping to make. So I think they will have progressed. Whether it's enough, I think they might need some early upgrades to really get them over the line in that regard.
Ed, there's one last thing, obvious thing about the car that I think we should talk about. The Mercedes is black again after a year of going back to silver in 2022. But there's a performance reason behind this time. Is this just the team taking weight shedding to the extreme?
Well, when the team originally went to black, it was an anti-racism message and a celebration of the team's commitment to diversity. There was a nod to that in what Mercedes has said, but Toto Wolff was very honest in saying it's primarily motivated by weight. So the black is a mixture of unpainted carbon fibre, and there is some matte black paint on it, apparently, but you could easily save many hundreds of grams, perhaps even more, by doing this. Wolff did say explicitly that the car is down to the minimum weight, or as he put it, their weight target, which probably indicates that they wanted to get it a little bit under, so they had a bit of ballast to play with to fine-tune the weight distribution within what's allowed. So it's a pragmatic, performance-driven choice rather than an aesthetic one or some kind of statement. And it's also something of a running theme in the 2023 cars we've seen so far, all of which seem to have increased black in their colour schemes.
Yeah, I think there'll be a few teams maybe jealous that they didn't think of going entirely black. And it worries me slightly that we are just going to end up with an entire grid of black cars as everyone tries to save as much weight as they can. But I think we've covered all the major things there around the Mercedes launch. And if you're looking for something else to watch during F1 pre-season, why not check out our video on Ferrari's launch, where I think there was a bit more optimism than we've seen here. And check out McLaren, who were probably more cautious or more downbeat than we've even detected from Mercedes as well.